let me just pray for you. You can be representative of all the lionesses, of course, this morning. All right. Heavenly Father, we thank you for Jo. We thank you for the message she's going to bring this morning on Esther. Just help us to hear the message that you want to bring to us through her. Amen.
Is that good? Okay, great, perfect. I've kind of always wanted to use the Brittany mic, but I'm a little bit scared now that I do have it. I also have a clicker, so there's lots of new things this morning. Good morning. My name is Joanna. For those that don't, I know lots of people here because this is the church I grew up in. My parents are Malcolm and Joy. This is where they met, and so I spent my youth and childhood here. So I really love being back. But if you don't know me, that's who I am and why some people do know me. At the moment, I live in Bristol. I work there as a scientist at the university. But I do really love coming back to Chawn. I love seeing people, but I also love your worship. That whenever I come here, I get such a sense of God being present among you and present in the church. I just love kind of soaking in that and being here for that. So thank you for having me. And hopefully I live up to the lioness statement. It feels like a lot of pressure. And thank you also for coming this morning despite the football. I really actually appreciate that as well. I thought it might be quite quiet. So today we're continuing our series, which is going through the book of Esther. Today I thought we could talk about two things I think are two major themes within this book, and those are the theme of identity and living as a Christian in a secular society or culture. And originally I thought this might be two separate points or talks, but actually I think they're quite intrinsically linked because I think that who that we say we are and the foundations or the ethics or values that we build our lives on will ultimately influence how we live, but also how much we're impacted by the culture that we're living within. And I think identity is a really interesting question because there are things that people use to identify us, and there's things that we choose to identify about ourselves. We have that internal versus external identity, and we can place different levels of importance on each of those different things, by ourselves and by other people. And so I think obviously one of our biggest questions maybe in life is, well, who am I? But kind of connected to that with our faith is saying, well, who does God say that I am? And why is this important? Well, I think it's because we are shaped by the culture that we swim in. Just like fish in water, we absorb whatever place that we're swimming within. And I think we have a choice as to what shapes us and what directs our lives. Will it be God and his truths, or will it be the values and priorities of our present culture? And I really think that there's something in the story of Esther that can really speak into that and into that question. So first I'm going to start with some context about the story. We're going to go through chapter 4 and then talk about what we can bring out of that related to these questions of identity and how do we be faithful in a faithless culture. So I'm sure we've already had a little bit of background from Greg and from Rachel, who spoke last week. So Esther is set around 480 BC. So this is actually 90 years after the Israelites have been exiled into Babylon, which is now Persia. So they've been taken out of their land, displaced, and made to move in with the Babylonians. But actually it was during Esther's time that some of them moved back to Jerusalem. They were allowed to return. But Esther, like some other Jews, decided to remain within Persia. And so this is kind of a similar story to what we see of Daniel as well. It's about displaced Jews being forced out of their land and having to live in a different country and in a pagan, non-Jewish culture that was very different to the one that they'd been in. And so the bit of the story just before where I'm going to read from, we hear that Esther is told by Mordecai, her uncle and adoptive father, to hide her identity. He tells her to not tell anyone that you're Jewish. Hide your nationality, hide your family background. And this enables her to enter into that beauty competition that Rachel spoke on last week, where basically they're competing to see who could become the new queen of King Xerxes. However, in chapter 4, this changes, in that Mordecai then asks Esther to show who she is. This happens because Mordecai, who actually does reveal that he's a Jew, refuses to bow down to Haman, who's one of the right-hand man of the king. Haman takes great offense at this and petitions to the king to remove all the Jews because he has a massive ego. And he says to the king, all these Jews that are living in your empire, I want to get rid of them. And the king agrees to this plan and gives Haman the power to enact the decree to annihilate the Jews. And this is where we join the story in chapter 4. So this is starting from Esther chapter 4. It's quite a long bit, but we'll start. And it should come up. There it is, perfect. When Mordecai learned of all that had been done, he tore his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes, and went out into the city, wailing loudly and bitterly. He went only as far as the king's gate, because no one clothed in sackcloth was allowed to enter it. in every province to which the edict and order of the king came, there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting, weeping, and wailing, many in sackcloth and ashes. When Esther's eunuchs and female attendants came and told her about Mordecai, she was in great distress. She sent clothes for him to put on instead of sackcloth, but he would not accept them. Then Esther summoned Hathach, one of the king's eunuchs assigned to attend her, and ordered him to find out what was troubling Mordecai and why. So Hathach went to Mordecai and in the open square of the city in front of the king's gate. Mordecai told him everything that happened to him, including the exact amount of money that Haman had promised to pay into the royal treasury for the destruction of the Jews. He also gave him a copy of the text of the edict for their annihilation, which had been published in Susa, to show to Esther and explain to her. And then he told her to go into the king's presence to beg for mercy and plead with him for her people, to basically reveal who she was to the king. Hathach went back and reported to Esther what Mordecai had said. Then she instructed him to say to Mordecai, "Will all the king's officials and people of the royal provinces know that for any man or woman who approaches the king in the inner court without being summoned, the king has just one law, that they be put to death, unless the king extends the golden scepter to them and spares their lives. But 30 days have passed since I was last called to go to the king." When Esther's words were reported to Mordecai, he sent back this answer: "Do not think, because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place. But you and your father's family will perish. And who knows, but that you may have come to your royal position for such a time as this." Then Esther sent this reply to Mordecai: "Go gather all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my attendants will fast as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish." So Mordecai went away and carried out all that Esther had said. Okay. Previously, when I was doing some reading for this sermon, I came across different views from different scholars, which isn't very helpful because they didn't seem to agree with each other. But one of the things is previously there's been confusion about the book of Esther and whether it should actually be in the Bible. And that's simply because there's no mention of God in the whole book, or anything really godly. And so scholars have long debated whether it should actually be included in the book. And in fact, of the 3 oldest scrolls that we have that we take the book of Esther from, there's one written in Hebrew, which is the one that we read today, translated into English. And there's 2 that are written in Greek, a shorter one and a longer one. The 2 that are in Greek are actually being edited, and additions have been added to make them more godly or religious. So Greek ones actually have God mentioned 50 times in the whole book. It's obviously very different to our reading of Esther. They also refer to biblical commandments. They change her description of Esther. They add in prayer and certain morality things that Esther says or Mordecai says. And so many scholars speculate that these additions were made to give the book a more religious character, to make it a more religious rather than secular story, and to give a more explicit retelling of God's involvement, to say instead, in our version, God's, his providence, his presence is kind of very implicit. We kind of have to read it between the lines to see it. In the Greek versions, it's very explicit, which I find very, very interesting. And kind of reading other articles about the themes and meaning, many people disagree about how they take Esther. See, some scholars take a more traditional and non-critical view and argue for the courage and bravery of Esther, whilst others highlight how secular it is, the fact that both Mordecai and Esther, they hide Esther's faith to her gain. She gets to become queen, live in a palace, live in comfort and opulence. They actively encourage her to break laws, to marry a Gentile, to go to feasts where there's wine and non-kosher food. There's no mention of Passover or certain festivals, and both characters appear distant from God. Instead, these scholars argue that Esther is actually someone who's been assimilated into the culture she's in. She's become like the culture she's been placed within. And why do I find this really interesting to read as well as confusing? Or maybe it's because actually Esther is more a story about someone who is lost in another culture and distant from God, but is still used by God. And potentially this is what makes this story more compelling, because it's a story of God awakening Esther and using her to redeem his people. And it shows that no matter how compromised we might feel, no matter how distant we might feel, that we are not written out of God's story. I love this verse in 2 Timothy 2:13. It says, If we are faithless, God, he remains faithful, for he cannot deny himself. I find this incredibly encouraging for us because it seems that wherever we are in our faith, however close we are with God, he remains faithful to us. However we feel in our current culture, our background, where we've come from, he remains faithful to us. Now, this might be a controversial take on the book of Esther, especially from the other previous talks, but I think also what gives weight to it as well is that so much of the Old Testament and the New Testament wrestles with this question: how do we as God's people live well in a foreign culture and one that doesn't honor God? How do we as God's people remain distinctive in a culture that is constantly challenging and pushing against God's ethics and morals and way of life? I think that sounds incredibly similar to our own culture, doesn't it, and our own struggle. And if you've read the Old Testament, you might see the same pattern being repeated again and again and again, to the point that it's kind of repetitive and expected, and you're almost like, Jews, what are you doing? It's that God speaks to the Jewish people. They worship God, remain faithful. Something happens, maybe doesn't happen. They basically get bored, impatient, tempted. They see what other people are doing around them. They're like, that looks good. They start to follow that. They start to worship other gods, other idols. This displeases God. God acts in judgment against Israel, or lets judgment happen to them, usually after much patience and many prophets. God punishes the Jews. They go into exile. They cry out to God. God rescues them. Then the whole cycle repeats itself again and again. And the heart of this issue and why this cycle keeps repeating is because the Jews lose their identity in a foreign culture. They become like the culture they're living in, the people that they've been forced to live with. They forget about God, they forget what he's told them and how to live, and they fall into sin. And the repeated lesson, the repeated moral for us, is that this never ends well for them. And so given that this is a fundamental question and struggle throughout the whole Bible, it's no wonder then that this is the same question and struggle that we wrestle with today as Christians. So what can Esther teach us about this question and this struggle? The first thing is that stepping out of a place of comfort is that we can step out into a place of, we should step out of a place of comfort, and that we can find God's provision there. I said before earlier that initially Esther is bid by Mordecai to hide her identity, to hide who she is. And then in chapter 4, he asks her to reveal her identity, which puts her in danger and could potentially remove her from a place of comfort and power. Take her from the place of palace, where she had protection, security, money, she was provided for. She had a choice about whether to reveal her faith and step out for God and for God's people, and to risk her life doing so, or to remain quiet and safe and silent. It's not the same for us in our culture. We don't have to face persecution or death when we step out, but I know that I felt the same tension when stepping out in my faith, being honest about maybe what I believe, not just I'm a Christian, but also some of the ethics that I live by. We don't have to put our lives on the line, but we still feel that tension. We can feel that tension in our day-to-day lives. And in some ways, the culture that Esther and Mordecai were living in is similar to ours. It's polytheistic in that they believed in many different gods. And I think that, one of the hardest or greatest sins in our culture is to be religious, but religious in a way that's exclusive. If we stand up and say, actually, I believe that God is the way, the truth, and the life, and there's only life if we go through him, you're suddenly in hot water with a lot of people. You can be religious, but only up to a certain point. And this is what made Esther and Mordecai's Jewish identity so dangerous, because they were a despised minority because of their religious background. But we can take courage from the fact that they stepped out despite of that danger, despite of the culture they were in. One of the verses I love in this, there's a classic one, which is, maybe you're here for such a time as this, but the one I love is in verse 16, Esther says, if I perish, I perish. Initially, Esther is fearful about stepping out, revealing her identity, as she fears retribution from the king, her husband. And we could take this to mean it's just like a fearful or a hopeless statement. Well, if I die, I die. But actually, maybe it's a statement of courage. See, Mordecai persuades her that if she continues to hide her true identity, it will come out anyway, in one way or the other. And the thing is, she'd probably die anyway because of it. Instead, I think it's a statement of courage and faith and trust in God. And this comes back to what Jesus would later say in the New Testament in Matthew. He says, whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me will find it. Had Esther refused to take a stand, to reveal her identity, to say, this is what I believe in, this is the God I follow, then maybe she and the Jews would have perished. Certainly herself would have perished. But we know from this, and also from teaching of Jesus, that entrusting our lives to God is the best option. That when we're called to lose our life, it's because God's standing there saying, like, look, step out for me, take courage, take heart, because I'm standing right there. You cannot see me, just as in the book of Esther, we don't see God explicitly, but he is there when she steps out to be in grace and protection, to hold Esther as she steps out in courage. Second point, about being distinctive. So it said, just like Esther, we are in a foreign culture. In Romans 12:2, it says, we are called to not conform to the pattern of this world. And Paul writes in 1 Peter 2:11, he actually calls us foreigners and exiles living in this world, or another translation say aliens. We're therefore called to be separate and distinctive from this world. And in fact, the word holy actually means to be set apart, to be separate. The rest of 1 Peter 2:11, I love how this is phrased in the Message version. It says, friends, this world is not your home, so don't make yourselves cozy in it. Don't indulge your ego at the expense of your soul. Live an exemplary life among the natives so that your actions will refute their prejudices. They'll be won over to God's side, and they'll be there to join in the celebration of when he arrives. I love that phrase, don't make yourselves cozy in this world. In being distinctive and true to God, we draw people to him. In the New Testament, Jesus phrased it like this, as calling us salt and light. Matthew 5, also the Message version, 13:16 says, let me tell you why you are here. You are here to be salt seasoning that brings out the God flavors of this earth. If you lose your saltiness, how will people taste godliness? You've lost your usefulness and will end up in the garbage. Here's another way to put it. You're here to be light, bringing out the God colors in the world. God is not a secret to be kept. We're going public with this, as public as a city on a hill. If I make you light bearers, you don't think I'm going to hide you under a bucket? I'm putting you on a light stand. Now that I've put you there on a hilltop, on a light stand, shine, keep open house, be generous with your lives, be opening up to others. In opening up to others, you'll prompt people to open up with God, our generous Father in heaven. There's so many things where Jesus is basically telling us what we are to be, what we are inherently, but then calls us to live up to that standard as well. He's saying you are salt, you are light, you bring out the God flavors and God's light in this world. So live like that, live in an open house, stand bright, be generous with others so that they see God's generosity through you. We're called out to live in faith as God has called us to be. So just as salt draws out flavor in food, we're supposed to bring out the good in the world around us, the God good in the world around us. And we know that when we use salt in food, we know that it only takes a little bit for us to taste the difference. If you've ever had really over-salted food, you know how disgusting it is. But there's more to say that it only takes a little bit of salt to make a change, to change the whole taste of the dish. Just it only takes a few of us as Christians living out for God to change the whole flavor of where our situation and the places that we're in. And so how do we do this? It can sound like quite a daunting task. But the thing is, we know that salt is inherently salty. Like we take it out of the salt shaker, if you get out of the sea or whatever, it's just inherently salty. It has that flavor in it. It doesn't have to work hard. It doesn't have to acquire other flavors from other places. It just is salty. That's what it is. Just as light is just light. It doesn't have to work hard to be like that. And it's the same with us. When God says, be salt and light in the earth, he's saying we do that through him, through his work within us. It's not something we have to work hard to be or have to acquire. He's saying, just be with me and it will shine out. If you rest in me and my presence, that will shine out in you. It's something inherent in us as children of God, not something we have to work for. And by being the salt and light, we can influence, improve, and make the world a better place for those around us. So to conclude, I've got 3 points that I thought might be relevant that maybe we could spend some time in prayer on. The first one was that Rachel spoke last week on the providence of God and seeing his grace woven throughout the story and the God coincidences and happenings. We can know that God is faithful even when he's not acknowledged or worshipped or honored by his people. When we do not live up to our calling in God, he is still faithful to us, and in his grace, he still works through us. Maybe that verse from 2 Timothy is the reminder that you need today to know that God is always faithful, even when we are faithless. That wherever you are at with God, whether you feel like you're right on his lap, you're right in his presence, or whether you're feeling really distant from him, is to know that he is close and that he is present and that he is at work in your life. Maybe meditating on that verse that when we are faithless, he is faithful. That's something that you'd be helpful for you to meditate on today and during this week. The other thing is about staying in a place of comfort or not. Jesus taught that we shouldn't remain in a place of comfort and that we should die to ourselves to save others. Esther is an example of someone who stepped out of her place of comfort to save others, and God provided for her in that moment. He offered her protection from the king, and in the moments to come, in saving her people. Is there somewhere in your life, maybe your relationships, your workplace, your home life, church, where you feel that God is prodding you to take out a step that you really don't want to, or that you're feeling quite anxious about? Well, just like for Esther, God's grace and protection is there for us. We can trust it, and we can step out in courage. Maybe there's a specific thing you can think of that God's like highlighting in your mind right now, or that you're feeling in your gut. Or maybe it's just something that for each of us this week, it could just be approaching others who may not know God or be open to his words. The strangers, co-workers, friends, family, our children. But just speaking to them and hoping that God will use you in such a way to soften their hearts, to humble their minds, and to share the love that God has shown to us, to others. Maybe it can just be that simple thing of speaking out, stepping out a little bit, telling someone about your time at church. What did you learn? Your weekend, how did you spend it? Sharing something about God, opening up, being generous to them so they can see God's generosity to us. Or maybe if you're feeling like you've lost your distinctiveness, you've lost your salt and your light, you don't feel like you're that different or set apart from our current culture. I think sometimes our role as Christians as salt and light can be hindered or prevented because we compromise, because we settle, because we choose a more convenient route, the more comfortable route, or we stay in our place of comfort, rather than doing what is best and pleasing to God. We can take a note of Esther's courage to move out of her place of comfort, but also knowing that we don't work at our distinctiveness ourselves. We don't just sit here trying to muster as much distinctiveness or holiness as we can. God's saying, no, I give it to you. It's you, it's me and you that makes the difference, that makes the flavor, and that makes you set apart. So maybe it's just resting in his presence this week, taking time, spending with him, being asked to be renewed and refilled with his presence so you can be distinctive. Not sitting on your own and then I'll come to God when I feel more holy. I'll come to God when I feel a bit closer. I'll come to God when I feel more courageous. Actually, coming to him and being like, this is where I'm at, God. Refill me, renew me, help me to reach out to others. So those are 3 places I thought we could stay. I'm going to pray to finish, and then we have like 15 minutes before the game. I don't know if the band's going to come back up. Depends how anxious people are to watch it. But I'll pray, and then we'll see what happens. Father God, we thank you for your grace and your faithfulness to us. I thank you so much for your love, that you are constant even when we flit and flee from you, that you are constant even when we rebel against you, that you are constant throughout everything. And I just pray that this week that we just know you by our sides, that we'd know your faithfulness, that we'd see those little God moments, those God coincidences, those just happenings where we go, that is God at work in my life. That even though you may appear hidden at times, that we can see that you are at work, that you are the hand that's guiding our lives, that's stepping out the stones in front of us. I pray that you give us courage this week to step out where you're calling us to. Maybe that's a baby step or a massive leap. I pray that we'd be filled with your courage and your grace to step out, and that we'd know that just as we are changed by you, it's others around us are changed by you. It's not us at work in them, it's you at work in us. That we can step out knowing that you do all the work. We just have to take the first step. You are the one that is through your power and your authority that these things happen. And that we would rest in that knowledge that it's you at work in us. And that we, just as we are changed by you, we can allow that power to change those around us as well. I pray that you be with us this week and you bless us. Amen.